And my question, more or less, is the African American community in this nation is in trouble now. Have we become again invisible people, even to you? And if so, you know, have you looked at our community in terms of what we need to do to deal with? I think Smucker said this shit. You know.
Okay. So we have an interesting array of questions there. How should we handle these? Do you want to, Leila, do you want to go first, or?
I'm itching.
Okay, go ahead, Max.
Do you want to go first?
I'll go. No, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, Smucker is maybe the smartest guy at Occupy and a dear friend, but he also wrote an article about why Occupy wasn't going to work the first week of the occupation. So I think he's doing a little penance. But so let me try and smush a couple of these together. I was responsible for organizing an action in East New York, which is overwhelmingly African-American part of Brooklyn, where we took over a foreclosed home. And it was probably the biggest mistake, worst run thing at Occupy. It was it was front page of the Washington or New York Post that it actually had been owned by not the bank. And, you know, so I think part of what the mistake there, where it came from, was that we were trying to work with community organizations who had a large existing base in that community, who we were essentially trying to provide some level of support for. So that was one way we were trying to make the transition. It was very, you know, intentional choice to try to make a transition to saying, okay, we can't organize. We're not good at organizing. We're not going to organize in the communities that need it the most. What we can do is we can mobilize people, and we can mobilize attention. And so you guys run the action, and we'll show up and we'll put our bodies on the line, and it will be this kind of magical combination of mobilization and organization. And I'm sorry to say it didn't quite work. And there have been other attempts to do similar things. And I do think that's in some ways speaks to the necessity of combining these two things and the importance of working with these communities, but also, you know, how difficult it can be, because I'll tell you what, you know, it wasn't a coincidence. This guy had not been at this house. The previous owner of the house that we took over had not been at the house for 2.5 years. The police went and found this guy, right? Like, it was front page of the New York Post because they were terrified. Like, obviously we had touched upon something right, but it was also, you know, they knew that that was what they had to destroy, and they did.
Leila, do you want to?
I would just, you know, I think other people
A little
have
closer to the mic.
Have a better sort of history and can make better use of the time. But on the question of risk, I think that's been a big issue in the Arab Spring context, because, you know, the majority of the people are not mobilized, whether it's because of out of fear or out of a desire to maintain stability. And I think it's been a real challenge to address the sort of the instinct to want to just to stay inside, to keep safe, to return to normalcy, and avoid the disruptions that occur when one protests and there is transformation. And I think that this, you know, is an issue that's particularly important when you think of strategies of violence versus civil disobedience. But I think there's also a need to make people uncomfortable in order to raise issues, particularly in this country, where I think comfort is very widespread and people don't really see that change is needed.
Phil, you want to comment?
Sure, that's actually a really good segue, because I think climate is maybe like the best example of something that everybody feels but doesn't really feel personally. And we've struggled with this for the entire time we've been organizing. I think the wildfires we're seeing this summer, the heat, the hurricanes, the weather patterns that are already changing are changing that equation pretty significantly. But the reality is that we've sort of had to spin emotional engagement almost out of nothing. And it's been a real challenge. And I think one of the ways that we feel like we've done it is to give people a sense that they're part of something larger than themselves, which I think in some ways is a risk, because you risk, if you feel like you're part of something larger than yourself, you risk sort of like your perspective of your own person as like the person who can sort of has agency over your own life. You're sort of part of the mob and you're part of the crowd, and you go where the crowd goes. And I think that's a risk that people feel. It's not a physical risk as such, but I think in some ways that emotional risk is more important than even putting your body on the line. It's when people risk sort of feeling hope for something better. And I think we all sort of felt that during the last Obama campaign to some extent. We were like, okay, well, I don't engage with politics in that way, or some of us do, but most people were like, I don't really engage in politics that way, but I'm going to put that aside right now, and I'm going to like invest in this emotionally, and hopefully it'll turn out right. And I think that's what we try to do when we're doing climate organizing. And I'm trying to transition that into the question about coalitions, but I think in some ways it also has to do with sort of like putting yourself out there as you're organizing too. And so I think that taking the risk of like sticking your neck out and actually beginning to organize people on the ground is one of the ways in which you build power within a constellation of other organizations and individuals in a movement. So like, for example, the first ever day of action that we organized, like nobody knew who we were. We were just a bunch of kids. And the only reason that anybody took part in this action is because we called them and asked them to. Like we literally cold called people around the world. And it turns out that no other environmental organization had ever done that before. And so we all of a sudden had this like constituency, even if it was a really loose constituency, that we could bring to the table and basically tell folks this is our strategy and we've got a ton of people behind it. And like, we didn't have to have a coalition to come up with that mobilization strategy. We just had to have people.
That's really interesting.
And so I think that's sort of where the organizing mobilization like
Really interesting.
transition happened for us. We were like, okay, we've just been in touch with a ton of people and we think that they're going to do this thing. And that was like really sort of threatening to the establishment organizations, but not in a really like overt way, which, we weren't like, this is our strategy, you're either with us or against us. It was sort of like, hey, you want to take part in this thing where we have millions of people around the world who are ready to take action on climate change? And they were sort of like, well, I guess so.
That's great.
So there's risk in that too. We sort of risked everything, and we didn't know that people were actually going to take action. We had just been in touch with them.
Arthur, you have any response to any of the questions?
There was a direct question on coalitions for you.
Not for me. I'm with the guy of the coalitions. I love coalitions. They are especially tasty for breakfast. I would like to comment on two things. One is the risk and the spread of the risk, and another one is how you build this stuff. And I mean, it's like the model we research is when you look at these struggles, at least when it comes to movements, it is about a struggle for the political and social space. And political and social space, especially in closed societies, is never granted. It needs to be conquered. This gives you the very stairway-looking approach to this kind of struggle, and I can see people coming from closed societies nodding because they know what I'm talking about. So you first of all, use a little bit of Clausewitz, pick the battles you can win. If you have 20 people, try to organize graffiti campaign. Please don't call for March of Millions because you will end up being ridiculous. And then second, when you win, know when and how to proclaim the victory and get the hell out of there. Don't wait for the tanks. because the tanks will come. And then, you use this as a platform to make the second step because you're building a little bit of the authority. So the question, what comes when, is you do a little bit of organizing, and then you do a little bit of the small thing which brings you to the victory, and then you do a little bit of feedback, and you use this to recruit more people, and now you have a little bit more platform. And we call this, because the SERPs are ridiculous in their triangles, we call this recruit, train, act triangle. So what you do, you recruit few people, you train them to do simple things, you make them do simple things, you use simple things to build up the authority, you make this publicity to recruit few more people. Now you train few more people, and this is very boring and not sexy and all, but this is how you get millions at the end of the day, not the vice versa. And when it comes to the risk, I think this is the big game, because what social scientists are not looking at, it's like this distribution between the fear and enthusiasm. And certain type of regimes just live out of fear. This is the air they breathe, because they rely on these coercive pillars of support, military and the police. And when you see people running towards the police, throwing the tear gas can back, you know the game has been changed. People are not afraid anymore. And it can happen in a blink of an eye. But what is very important is to find the level of affordable risk. Okay, you'll find so much people getting ready to go out on the street, being detained for 2 hours or swallow a little tear gas. This is not a problem. What you are facing now in Syria, if you go and demonstrate, you'll be shot. And even better, your family will be shot with you. So you look at these risks and say, what are these tactics which will allow people to participate? So think about walking half speed, driving half speed, like in Chile, having, a telephone, ringtones. What are these tactics which will allow people to take affordable risks? Because this is how you keep on people going. So I will end up with something from my expertise. I'm not the expert in political science. In fact, I hate political science. I understand it. I graduated on fishes. So the movements are very much like sharks. In order to stay alive, sharks must swim at all times because they don't have gills like rest of the fish, and because their fins are ancient, they can't swim backwards. They can swim in only one direction, forward. So keep on recruiting, training, acting.
All right, and on that note, it's time to wrap up. I had said we're going to go back and give each panelist a moment to reflect. I wonder, though, if we might do something just slightly different, which is just ask people to call out what some of their takeaways are from this panel discussion. I think it's been really rich and offered, clearly this organizing, mobilizing, I think Dave's comment is right on target about the tension, the relationship, understanding it's not like the head versus the heart, it's how do they engage with one another and so that you raise the odds of winding up with what you hope to wind up with. But could we just hear from some folks? What's your takeaways from this panel? Yeah, just shout it out.
Well, it's kind of sense. There's a lot of organizations, they want to mobilize, in Arthur's case, because it shows their strength, but they don't actually have an incentive to change themselves, and so, because they don't want to change their actual leadership system.
Yeah. What else? What are some other takeaways?